Greetings everyone, welcome back. We're continuing in our third session of Jainism. We left off just at the end of a discussion of two types of Jain sculptural forms, a meditative yogic position of discipline and a standing image of the Jainist sculpture representing the sacred jina, the exemplary jina of embodying enlightenment through the Jainist practices. I'll quickly show you that just to remind you, but you just saw it if you're watching this in sequence. But I always like to do a quick summary. Okay, so we left off discussing the two kinds of Jain sculptural forms, but one of discipline, detachment, and meditation. Go back to that video if you have questions about it. And the second, a unique Jain sculpture that is the figure is standing in absolute stillness and absolute harmlessness to reflect the aspect of Jainism that is so central to the belief, which is the concept of ahimsa, which you should know, which is nonviolence to all living creatures as a way to purify one's karma to lead to a path of liberation from samsara. Jain manuscripts, in this section I'm going to trace two themes, I suppose is the right word. First is the story of Mahavira, the foundational figure of Jainism, appears in many Jainist manuscripts beginning in around the 14th, 15th century because of a wider availability of paper. And the story is an important foundational story, but it's also one that is similar in its structure to other stories about previous jinas, the 23 preceding jinas that came before Mahavira. And so there's a rich tradition of manuscript painting, illustration, and transcription of the sacred stories of the jina. And this forms the body, a significant part of the body of Jainist texts. So these manuscripts are use opaque watercolor and gold leaf on paper, and they are notable in their simplistic, not simplistic in the sense of not sophisticated, but very reduced, not to the point of abstraction as we discussed in our much earlier module, but a greatly reduced and simplification of form of the figures. They're relatively flat. There is not a lot of perspective, and the colors tend to be blues, reds, and greens, sometimes brownish yellows, as you can see here. And the features grow increasingly sharp and simplified over time. The only time we find frontal-facing figures is the jina himself. So that's just a few of the basic principles of the visual operations at work in these manuscripts, but I'll talk more and in more detail. Now let's go to the story of the birth and the entry of Mahavira into human realm to become the exemplary jina that founds Jainism. So the manuscript that tells the story is known as the Kalpa Sutra. And the Kalpa Sutra contains biographies of Mahavira, but also another named Parshavanatha, but we'll only focus on Mahavira in this section, in this class. We simply couldn't go into more detail. And the writing of this text, probably the text itself, not the manuscript we're looking at, but the text, the story, the legend, is about 980 to 990 years after the time that Mahavira achieved nirvana or moksha, freedom from samsara, and became an exemplary jina, an enlightened being, full of light, luminosity, and through reverence toward this exemplary figure, Jaina people, practitioners sought to emulate and achieve enlightenment as well. So these jinas are significantly about emulation, not as deities as we see later in Hinduism, where through devotion the deity can intervene on your behalf to facilitate freedom from samsara. That's a distinctly important development in Hinduism, which we just make a distinction from late Brahmanism, and we understand Hinduism more or less to cohere into what we understand the rich and synergistic belief system of Hinduism to happen in dialogue with Buddhism and Jainism and the heterodox reactions to late Brahmanic practices, as well as, of course, carrying Brahmanic practices into the belief system. So this scene here we're looking at is showing the story, a very important statement about the Jaina rejection of Brahmanism. So according to the traditional biography, before Mahavira's final rebirth, Mahavira had been moving through a long cycle of rebirths like what we see in Buddha in our next page and the Jakarta tales, and you've seen that in your reading. Similarly, Mahavira had many lives to work through his karma until he finally reached a life where he was destined to achieve moksha or nirvana. And knowing this, so he first is conceived in the womb of a Brahmin woman. But the god Indra, which you remember from our Vedic material, doesn't disappear in Jainism as part of the Jainism cosmological framework of the world of jinas. So we find Indra, as well as we do other Vedic and also later Hindu gods, making appearances and crossing into Jainism, but never as the agent to enlightenment. They're present, they're enriching the faith, but they are not the vehicles of enlightenment. Enlightenment comes from discipline and practicing the 3 jewels talked about in the first session, and comes from a life devoted to remarkable harmlessness to all forms of life. That is the path, not any devotion directly to Indra. And that distinguishes it from late Vedism and Hinduism, which the late Vedic Brahmanic period more or less evolved into parts of Hinduism significantly. So what we're seeing here is a birth scene where Indra has sent his commander, Haringamesin. Here's the spelling, but it's not something I would ever test you on, but it's important to know for the story here. Haringamesin is one of Indra's commanders, and he has sent him to the woman, the Brahmin woman, who is destined to conceive of but not give birth to. Think of that. Conceive of but not give birth to Jainism. The founder of Jainism, Mahavira. So what we have here is an image of the woman, the Brahmin woman, reclining. She has just had the little fetus of Mahavira removed from her womb by Haringamesin, who is holding it with 2 hands here. This is almost looks like a heart of Mahavira. And the head of Haringamesin is of a goat, reminding us of these wonderful hybrid anthropomorphic figures coming out of the Vedic tradition. He has the head of a goat, and he is going to deposit it into a lower caste, one below Brahmanism, which is, try to remember, that's the warrior class, the Karastriya. And that scene follows, but not without a detail of this scene. Notice this before I move forward. Just notice the flatness of the treatment of form here. There's not a lot of depth, the very saturated colors, and look at the sharpness of the features and the articulation of figures in profile. That's because neither of these figures are the Jina that is the subject of this manuscript, Mahavira, indeed the founder. Often in this Western style of Indian painting, we have a second kind of eye seeming to protrude out on the left. You see there's another eye with a little iris. Can you kind of see that? Like a bulging eye on the left. This is a perspective effort to try to show two eyes in profile, and it's very characteristic of Western Indian painting in the 15th, 16th centuries, and this style of painting which we call Western style of medieval and early modern Indian painting. As these time passes, the features get increasingly sharp and more schematic. So this is just simply a stylistic point, so that you can sort of see the vocabulary of the visual language here. So here is a page from the Kalpa Sutra manuscript showing the birth of Mahavira. So the little Mahavira has been placed in now a warrior caste woman's womb, mother's womb. And here is the little infant Mahavira. And you can see the second protruding eye. You can see the second protruding eye here. And we continue to see these very flat treatment of form. Here's a detail. So you can definitely see. And presumably this is Indra here, observing. I assume so. I can't say definitely. And this is a page from the Kalpa Sutra manuscript showing Mahavira giving alms. So here is Mahavira now. Notice how sharp these features are. This is a very particular style of Western India in the 15th, 16th century. And he is distributing alms. What are alms? Alms is charity to the poor, and not just alms that are extra. He's taking off his clothes and removing his jewelry. He's renouncing his material princely state because he was a warrior prince originally in a Brahmin's womb, but then went to a warrior prince's womb and is born a prince of the warrior caste. And he is removing his precious jewels and wealth and giving it away to the poor. And that is an indication of the charity and amisa of the Jain faith. Here is a detail. And often you see that figures are not represented in a perspectival system that recedes into space, but is organized along tiers or planes, levels along the same pictorial surface. The aureole of blue, circular form here is like a halo, a kind of a typical. We see this often in sculptures if they're not damaged. Notice the figures, the old man and the two figures here receiving alms do not have that kind of halo, nor do they have this crown, which is typical. And lastly, we have an image from the Kalpa Sutra where Mahavira is plucking out hair from his head, and this is attended by Indra here. So the practice of pulling out hair from the head by hand is one of the penances of the Orthodox Jain nuns and monks, and it's part of the transition into the existence of a life of purity, to remove and endure the pain of pulling hair out of one's head. This is part of the Jainist practice. It's very important, so we see it here. We see a very pointed features. We see the elongated earlobes indicating the princely status. Here's a detail. Oops, sorry. A beautiful detail. And then finally, This is the last one of the late pages from the Kalpa Sutra showing Mahavira having attained enlightenment. So there's numerous struggles that Mahavira goes through, but these usually aren't after birth and adulthood, into adulthood, that aren't shown, that are trials that he must pass through to reach enlightenment. But enlightenment is shown with Mahavira in surrounded by the cardinal points, 4 directions, and this is the way temples, which we'll talk about in our next session, are structured with 4 points. And then surrounding the enlightened figure of Mahavira, we have animals and other figures in a state of devotion. And here is Mahavira prior to, once having achieved enlightenment. We're working with the type of Jainism that believes that Mahavira went out and became a apostle of Jainism, if you will, rather than the other branch of Jainism known as Digambara, where simply becomes a still standing figure that does not even need clothes, who emits a sacred sound, and that is the way he conveys his enlightenment. That is coming from the Digambara branch, not the Shivantabara, which we're looking at now. And that's in your reading, so you can review that. So we're going to stop here, and we'll return for our final session on temples. I'll see you soon.